All right, so today's topic is vegetative morphology. As I mentioned earlier, we will get into um, a lot of terminology at the beginning, and it's going to help us to build up our understanding. And really, if we don't have the words to talk about the plants, we can't really start talking about interesting features of those plants. Fortunately, some of these terms are going to be familiar to you, right? I hope you know what a stem is at this point. Have a rough idea. Some of these they're not going to be curveballs exactly. Other ones will probably be terms you've never encountered before. And actually, my first image here, this is one that kind of upsets the expectation of what we've got going on with plants. That vegetative parts of a plant are the ones that are more associated with growing. So um, generally, I think of those as structure and photosynthesis. So leaves, stems. For many plants, I guess for most plants, that's the beginning part of their growth. So they start as a small seed. They've got to grow up to have a size big enough to produce flowers. So the portion of their growth before they're making flowers, that's the vegetative growth. Also might remind you of a term, vegetables, right? Things that we eat. So occasionally here we'll be upsetting this idea of vegetable versus fruit. And a lot of things that we think of as vegetables are botanically fruits. But we'll kind of let that slide. It's one of those trivia things you hold over your family when you go back for holidays. Like, did you know that tomatoes are fruits? You probably knew that. Anyway, vegetable parts, vegetative parts are shown here. And this is a plant that it's called Ruscus, R-U-S-C-U-S. And it's got a little bit of a weird production here. Something that you don't often see, something you really shouldn't see, is flowers. These are flower buds here. Flowers appear to be growing out of the middle of a leaf. So my illustration here is a rather bizarre plant for that aspect. It's kind of breaking the rules. So plants do have some rules as far as what they produce, when and where. And if you've got a rule breaker, then there's usually an explanation for it. And what's going on here is that these are actually big pieces of flattened stem. So, gotcha. So it looks like a leaf. It's functioning like a leaf, but technically, if you look in the right locations, you find evidence for that being a stem. That's what's going on there. That's why it's got flowers growing out of it. But otherwise, pretty clean distinction between the vegetative part and the reproductive part. That'll be what we get into in the next topic. So understanding vegetative parts of plants involves understanding kind of how they get there in the first place. And plants have some important differences from animals. So you're coming at this from an animal perspective. We just have maybe more general familiarity with animals, being animals ourselves. When a person is born, that person looks like a person, right? When a plant is born, so how many fingers did you have when you were born? With luck, all the ones you got today, right? Oh, please. All right. I need a page. Add a page. Make this work. All right, I'll say you're planting your garden. Put a plant in there. You might know that that's a plant as you're getting started, but it doesn't have, doesn't have all the parts of that plant. Whereas you're born with pretty much all the features. You could count and name all the parts as a baby that you have today. So I have a couple of words on this intro slide that refer to, I think words sometimes are anchors for ideas. So I guess if I ask you about this on an exam, I'll ask you to, describe what it is. Maybe not. I don't know. I try not to have people spout back memorized definitions, but I think it's a good way to think about plants. So a couple terms here, indeterminate and modular. And indeterminate, this is something that some animals are described as having indeterminate growth. Any ideas what that means? Heard of it? Right?
Is it looking like something develops, like it looks similar to how other looks like, and then it's, as it grows, it's similar?
That's a good thought. Yes, remind me of your name. Seth, thank you. Okay. All right. Becky. Grows by adding parts. Have you taken one of my classes before? That's what I usually talk about with modular. So yeah, it's basically, I think we're kind of getting at it. Indeterminate is negative. Determinate is sort of predestined. So having a programmed size number of leaves, for example, that would be determinate. So like a human, you go to the pediatrician as a kid, and the pediatrician can pretty well plot your growth and say, you're going to turn into this tall, and um, the arms grow at a rate that's proportional to the legs and so on. And we have more of a determinate growth. Indeterminate means, as I've illustrated here with this photograph I got, basically that it can continue growing over time. So if you look at a plant at a certain age, it might just keep growing for as long as it can. So through the plant's life, it just keeps growing. No reason to stop. That's pretty typical of plants. It's just growing to fill the space and the resources they have. Things are good, why stop? It's not all plants. There are some plants, for example, annuals that grow for 1 year, basically as much as they can, and then they're done after a year. But it's, for many plants, not really fixed how big they're going to get. So I guess I think of indeterminate as I use it, or as I'm thinking about it, as more of a size thing, how big. And then modular gets a little bit at what Jackie was saying. Plants growing by adding modules. So if you have, hoping to get a better way to draw in the future. So one example of a module is a leaf. You could put these leaves on a plant, and this little plant, if we follow it through time, is going to increase in size, not just becoming a bigger version of its little self, but it starts off with these 2 leaves, and it's going to keep adding leaves. So if you follow plants through their life, in general, the parts that they made earlier stick around. And the new parts get added on to the areas of these plants that have grown. We're adding some more leaves, some more stems. And one handy thing about modules, one of the focuses of this class is going to be identifying plants. So if you take this fig plant, common house plants, figs, if you take one of the leaves off of there, one of those leaves is pretty much the same as every other leaf on that plant. So if you're trying to identify a plant, you don't have to grab the whole dang thing. You can take a piece of that and say, I've got 2 leaves, and I know what the leaves look like on that plant. So top leaves, bottom leaves, you can see they're about the same size, same shape, same sheen, and so on. That's also pretty common. So sort of from a genetic programming standpoint, there's a program for make a leaf. And a lot of times it's just repurposed across the organism. Same thing with stem, adding additional stem. You can see in older plants, parts of those plants that look like other parts of the plants, and so on and so on. All right, oh, there we go. So growing by adding organs and organs of the same type, basically. And then indeterminate, often used as basically can keep growing as it gets older, just keeps growing. All right, so I think kind of breeze through these definitions. These are just kind of more conceptually about thinking about plants growing. Terms that are sometimes used, shoot and root. The shoot is the above ground portion of the plant. Root is the below ground portion of the plant. And the growing parts of the plant are called apical meristems. So apex is a term referring to the tip. And in plants, it's important to remember that there's an above ground tip and also below ground tip. So you can get a root apex underground and a shoot apex above ground. And what we see on here, kind of towards the tips of these shoot pieces, the main central shoot, and then also these side shoots, leaves get smaller as we get towards the tips. Why do the leaves get smaller? Maybe. Becky? Still growing. Yeah. That's basically what you see at the growing tips is that it's sort of showing you evidence of the active growing. So you get closer and closer on this, you get smaller and smaller leaves, and there's actually a collection of microscopic leaves in that so-called apical bud at the tip of the plant. So those leaves potentially can fill out and become the same size as other leaves on the plant. It's hard to generalize across all plants. I don't want to, so it is possible to have different sized leaves on different parts of the plant. But they're sort of built on the same program anyway. We're going to embrace a lot of differences in this class. Okay, so apical meristems are where we've got new growth from. That lends the pattern that I kind of illustrated here, where older parts of a plant, if you take that old initial part of the plant, all that tissue basically stays in place. So plant cells are built more like bricks. They stay in place, and the other growth is built on top of them. So to grow new, they've got to grow from the tips of what's able to expand the plant. Okay, root apex, shoot apex, as I suggested. The so-called primary growth is growth from the tips, often growth upwards, what we usually think about. So plants competing their way towards sunlight. Along the shoot, there are portions that have basically stuff coming out of them, and portions of shoot that are just naked stem. So this portion of naked stem is called an internode. And places where something is growing out of the stem, that's a node. And those terms will be helpful for us to think about, for example, the number of leaves you can find at a node. And we'll also see the connection between where leaves are produced and also the locations where these side branches are produced. Secondary growth, if we see it, is growth in thickness. And that's the kind of growth that can take a tree and make a tree trunk out of it. So a really thicker stem, or in smaller plants, they also do that to a lesser degree. So zooming in a little bit more, technically at these apical tips, there's a cluster of cells that are often rapidly dividing. And that cell division is where the new organs come from. And locations that are prepared to grow on the shoot, those feature as buds. So there's a word you probably knew already. So the bud is just a growing tip that is covered by overlapping leaves. So you can have a bud on an actively growing plant, or this time of year, a lot of our woody plants, or all of our woody plants, have winter buds, dormant buds that are ready to grow, but today would be a really bad day for that. So if you grow out fresh, juicy, wet tissue on a day when it's 0 degrees outside, not great for those. So the winter buds are often protected from the cold, but inside of there is a growing tip that's ready to grow a new shoot and new leaves when conditions get better. All right, so we got buds at the tip, and then located in these locations called axils, A-X-I-L. That makes them axillary buds. Those are usually produced at the location right above where a leaf attaches. That's the location that's called the axil. So when we get out in the field, maybe you'll get a chance to see these, or we'll get some as we have our lab starting next week. But the location where a leaf attaches to the stem I don't know, my handwriting came through okay. That's A-X-I-L. And that's a place where buds are formed. So it's kind of a nice insurance policy for plants. So as they're growing, it's possible that the tip that's growing gets chewed off by somebody, damaged, frozen. Having those other buds distributed along the stem is a backup plan. And they can grow out from those buds as well. So you can see kind of going down this plant from the tip. This is the younger part of the plant towards the tip, and the older parts toward the base. And these side shoots here, these lateral branches, are the result of growing out those axillary buds. So it can be a way for a plant to grow, sort of take advantage of light sideways, fill in more space, produce maybe new places for flowers to grow. All right, buds, axils, I think we covered that pretty well. Believe it or not, I like to give you a light version of vocabulary. Scientists are pretty big on vocabulary, and I would say botanists, people who study plants, are, some of them, are just insane about terminology. I need a special term for that one thing that's found on only 5 plant species in the world. So if you ever encounter a word you don't know, this is one of the advantages of living in the modern age. You could probably pull out your phone and look up that term. So sometimes you're looking at a guide and it's asking you to determine if something is present on your plant that you're trying to identify. If it gives you a word you don't know, you can often look it up in the same book you're using to identify it. Or if you have an internet connection, you can access something like this. I'm going to say that's probably, hey, it still works. So this one is, I think as much as anything, I want to illustrate just how many darn words there are out there. This is put together by the Missouri Botanical Garden, which is one of the foremost plant information resources out there. They've got different letters to start with. Here we're in the A's. All right, that's almost done. All right, that was the A's. So Some of them not so useful, maybe. Oxoblast, a long shoot. Um, so on and so on. I think the illustrations don't work anymore. Nothing. So if you do encounter words you don't know, you can look them up on here. This is a nice resource. If you want a resource written by botanists, that's a good way to make sure you're getting an appropriate definition. Then we talked about vegetative and reproductive. And what I've got on here is just an illustration of how in most plants, there's a pretty clean distinction between vegetative and reproductive. So vegetative is typically the leafy green part of the plant. As far as a plant's growth strategy, when they get started, they've got to amass some energy. So they've got to do photosynthesis to get the energy that they can then put towards flowers. So we usually see green leafy structures toward the base, and then later, often in the same year, a big switch to flowers. So in this plant, we got leaves, 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 flowers. Here we go, leaves, leaves, leaves. This one's nice on the right here. Shows the leaves getting smaller. So it's sort of decreasing the investment in leaves and then increasing in flowers. Nice clean split there between leaves and flowers. This one, pyrola, has leaves at the base and then a stalk dedicated to producing flowers. Here's a tree, cherry tree. It's got leaves throughout, but then it's got these bits of flower cluster produced kind of along the branches. So what I want to show you is that you can usually look at a part of a plant and say, vegetative, reproductive. One of the things that's going to be maybe important, certainly an important consideration when we think about evolution, is comparing equivalent structures. So terminology is one way that we can make sure that we're talking about the same things. So if you call a leaf every time, then you're talking about comparable structures. If you were to mistake a stem for a leaf, then you'd be looking at things that aren't exactly comparable. So I've got on here, this is just a little collection of buttercup species. And you might be able to see on here some features that are comparable. So we've got flowers. We'll get into with the reproductive portion of the topic. Flowers, here's some flowers on a different species, different size, different color petals. Flowers over here, we've got these bracty things along the stem. And then the leaves, you probably recognize the leaves, compare their size and shape and number of lobes and so on. And maybe the most extreme difference that you can see on here is this plant on the left actually grows in, can grow in water. And the parts of it that grow underwater develop into these fanning leaf structures. So that thing, if you didn't know what it was initially, you're like, what is that? It's got a lot of features in common with a leaf as far as the same position. It's got similar structure around the base. So it's kind of flared at the base here like the other leaves are. So by the correct comparison, you say those are leaves. I know that that's a modified leaf. So this one's kind of a doable example. Sometimes you encounter a structure in a plant that's initially a little hard to know, what am I looking at here? So the concept of basically comparing things that are equivalent is homology, and that refers back to one of the things we imply by the use of that term is that they had a common ancestor. So there was an original buttercup that had one kind of leaf, and in one plant it became this kind of leaf, in another plant it became this kind of leaf. All right, good so far? So here's some terms you probably have encountered. Put some technical definitions on them. So one thing that, one of the first things, if you read a description of a plant, one of the first things that comes up is the habit of the plant. Plants have habits. Good habits, bad habits, who knows? Habit refers to basically the overall growth form. And there's some main categories we use here. One big type of habit is being herbaceous. So I like to say the H in these, herb and herbaceous. I've heard it where people don't say the H, herb and herbaceous. To your own preference on that. But not exactly the same thing as like a culinary herb for cooking, right? So herbs are, that's got a definition for food. This one has a definition for botany, and a herbaceous plant is one that in our climate dies back to the ground in the winter. It's kind of handy. This definition works a little bit better for our part of the world. We have this nice clean definition for it. So um, again, right now outside, if you have juicy wet parts on your plant, they're going to freeze today. And freezing is usually not great for plant parts. So as a solution to that, these herbaceous plants, they kind of work around that. So they're either okay with parts of their plant dying. Sometimes the whole plant dies. And I'll go ahead and throw it on here. I think I have it on a later slide, but I'll put it on just while we're in this topic. Um, so herbaceous isn't always that the whole plant dies. There's sort of a subset of herbaceous plants that are known as annuals. And those die above ground and below ground at the end of the growing season. Whereas a herbaceous perennial, that one survives year to year. The above ground part dies, the below ground part survives. So this time of year, there are parts underground that are not frozen, or you can take modifications to keep your plant parts that do get frozen, keep them from suffering too much damage. So not unlike animal strategies, right? Going underground is one way to do it. Packing yourself with lots of insulation is one way to do it. So both of these, annual and perennial, those both fall under the category of herbaceous. And herbaceous is contrasted with woody. So not just a texture thing, but woody plants, as we talk about them. The woody plants are the ones that survive above ground during the winter. So they have structures that are tough enough, insulated enough, stay alive inside of those woody bits. So bark can help with that, other modifications. And trees and shrubs are both woody. There's kind of just a size split on trees and shrubs. It's hard to be universal about that. So generally, I've got it here at 5 meters, or about 15 feet. So less than that size is a shrub, more than that size is a tree. Obviously, trees start small but become taller, so usually by species. So a tree that has the capacity to get bigger is a tree through its whole life, basically a characteristic of the species. Shrubs at their biggest don't really get bigger than that 5-meter height. Another shrub feature is that you often get multiple stems from the ground. So this honeysuckle here would be one plant, but it's branching out a lot near the ground. So it's got a strategy where it's planning to do a lot of photosynthesis in a area that's closer to the ground, so it spreads out more. Whereas trees might be investing growing upwards, and to be mechanically stable at that height, it can be important to have one central stem. And then vines are kind of all over across these different categories. A vine is a plant that doesn't support its own weight, as in like doesn't hold itself up. It actually climbs up other structures, usually other plants. Or poison ivy is a noteworthy woody vine, shown growing up a tree trunk here. All right, so we pretty well covered duration. So these are herbaceous plants, annual, perennial. Biennial is relatively rare. These are plants that take 2 years to complete their growth. So the one in the middle there, that's one you might be familiar with, mullein. In its first year, it makes only leaves, and then in the second year, it has enough energy stored where it can make the flowering stalk. That happens in a few plants. So that makes it a biennial. And over here, left side, this is an annual, right side is a perennial. To be honest, I can't always look at a plant and tell you whether it's an annual or perennial. I get frustrated when you go through a key and it's asking you to identify a plant, and it starts off with, well, this is an annual. Basically, one of the general things is that an annual plant has not invested a lot of energy into below ground structures. So an annual plant has 1 year to grow, and it does basically as much as it can to produce lots of flowers, lots of seeds, because those seeds are the only thing that's going to keep its species going into the next year. A perennial plant, on the other hand, if you dig up a plant and you've got a bulb or a thick stem or something like that, that's often indicating that you've got a multi-year perennial plant. One term that sometimes comes up is caulescent. And again, this one is a little hard to pin down sometimes. I often throw this term at students, and then they're very keen to know, is this caulescent or acaulescent? Sometimes it's very clear, sometimes a little more fuzzy. Caulescent refers to having a leafy stem. So not just a stem, but a stem with leaves in the vegetative portion. So this is a nice caulescent plant here. Whereas these other two plants, their vegetative leaves are only at the base. So this one's growing kind of sideways off of rocks. But these are its vegetative leaves, and the stem only serves to produce this flower. So it's not a leafy stem. That one counts as acaulescent. Same thing over here. We've got leaves at the base and a flowering stalk heading up. So if the leaves are only at the base, they're often called rosette, as it says there. And sometimes you run into this term scape as the flowering stalk of a acaulescent plant. And sometimes you run into a scapegoat if you look really carefully. Not actual size. Or is it? Some plants get a term for not growing upright exactly. I'd say the one you typically run into is prostrate. The terms I'm putting into this section, some of them I think it's good to just have seen them, and if you run into them, think, oh, okay, I got a rough idea of what that means. You're always welcome to look those up. These are words that might not be as instantly memorable to you. But they're sort of variations on the same thing. Plant that doesn't grow upright or erect is often used as a comparison. So prostrate along the ground. And as they're defining them, I just kind of think of them all as the same thing, but it depends on the author's choice as to which one they're going to use. Repent here, repent is rooting from its nodes. And then decumbent is this like trying to grow up, but too heavy to do it all by itself. So it sort of grows sideways and then angling upwards is decumbent. Decumbent actually comes from the word like for a bed, to lie down. Sleepy, we'll call it sleepy. And if you're really into plant growth habit, you might wear a sign and tell people about it. It really loves repent plants. All right, these are some of the more important, more commonly used terms you'll run into when you're encountering a plant. You need to identify it. This is one of the first things that often gets thrown at you. It's how the leaves are arranged on the stem. So there's a fancy term for that, phyllotaxis. Phyllo is Greek for leaf. Phyllotaxis or phyllotaxy. So we talked about internodes and nodes, and if there is one leaf produced at each node, that's called alternate phyllotaxis. On this one, you can see one leaf here, then an internode, then one leaf here, then an internode, then one leaf here, and so on and so on. Here we've got them kind of covering up each other at the base, but still one at a time. So both of these are in the category of alternate, and spiral is basically they're appearing at intervals. If you look down at the plant, you'd see it kind of going around in a circle as those leaves come out. Disticus is coming out on one side or the other side. So for this slide, I'm more interested that you know the alternate, opposite, and whorled, but kind of helpful to see these other terms that might show up. So alternate, one leaf at a time. Opposite is two leaves at a time. So anywhere there's a node, there'll be two leaves coming out across from each other, opposite each other. And this form of decussate is just showing that they rotate 90 degrees between one node and the next. So if you look down on a plant, up. So if you got the stem here, a plant that's decussate would have those two leaves across from each other. And then the next one, we'll draw them a little bit smaller to show you that they're the next set of leaves toward the top, also across from each other, so on. So they're occupying the up-down plane and then the left-right plane. Decussate. And then whorled. Whorled is pretty rare for plants in our area. Whorled is 3 or more leaves coming out of the same node. Anybody want to throw a favorite plant at me? No. Need one that's in there. Looking. All right. I thought I'd maybe show you a description of a plant. This is from the Flora of North America. This is, it's a work in progress. We'll encounter this in a few different ways during this course. This is one way to identify your plants if you don't know what you've got. It's a very big comprehensive resource. Its long name is Flora of North America, north of Mexico. So basically every plant species found in the United States and Canada should be on this project. We see some features here. So we've got stems erect. I mentioned that, but maybe I should have it on the slide there that this is contrasting with those more laying down kind of growth forms, prostrate and so on. Let's see, leaves whorled here. Here's one. As you go through, if you're pretty comfortable with your botany terms, the words on this, most of them should be ones you're okay kind of forming a mental picture with. But on day one, it might be a lot to take in. Okay, so as I mentioned, big categories, alternate, opposite, and whorled. And another useful feature is that the leaves are arranged in the same way that the stems are. So the branches on a branching woody plant, for example. So this time of year, if you wanted to identify a tree that doesn't have any leaves on it, you could actually still use this information. And you'd say, are the side branches alternate or opposite? One of the big features you'd use to identify a winter tree. We'll go outside when the weather's not oppressive and maybe explore some trees that are just getting started later in the spring. So the reason that happens, as I mentioned before, these axillary buds where the leaves are located are also where these buds are located. And so when branching happens, side branching, the side branches grow out from the locations of leaves. Now about those leaves. Leaves also one of the more commonly used features to identify a plant with. And off the bat, I'd say there's one thing to watch out for, maybe a misconception sometimes about what actually makes up the leaf. So the leaf actually consists of the whole thing as it departs from the stem. So in this illustration here, this gray feature is the stem. And everything else that's labeled, except for the bud, is actually part of the leaf there. And the part that I'd say most often would get ignored is this leaf stalk, known as the petiole. So petiole is the stalk, and then the blade is the broad tissue making up most of the photosynthetic part. So like a big solar panel. Broad and flat. I don't know if I have a great sessile leaf on here. So if you had a sessile leaf, that would be one that just comes out from the stem without any kind of stalk on it. That's certainly common enough. I just didn't have a picture of it on that slide. All right, so blade, technically the lamina here, same thing as the blade. Petiole, and then depending on the leaf, can be simple or compound. A compound leaf is shown here for the rose plant. And this whole thing that's shown is technically one leaf. It's just a compound leaf. So it's a compound leaf because it's got these pieces of the blade that are divided from each other and they're divided all the way down to the vein. So the vein kind of looks like a little bit of stem there, but it's technically just the vein that doesn't have any leaf blade with it. How do you know you've got a compound leaf? This one's kind of handy. It's got these stipules at the base. So these also belong to the leaf. This is a feature. Sometimes you get one or two of these outgrowths from the leaf base. Those can be helpful for identifying plant groups. Probably one of the more useful ways to tell what a leaf is around here, we have these deciduous plants that drop their leaves in the winter. The features that fall off, those are the leaves. If it's built a stem, the stem should probably stay on the plant. But the leaf is kind of all one thing. And so this rose, if you got rose bushes, they would have been dropping their leaves from this location. And everything that's shown in the image would have fallen off in the winter. All right, so compound leaves are contrasted with simple leaves. Both of these are simple leaves, as in not compound. But you do sometimes have lobes. So this oak leaf is a nice illustration of a lobed leaf, where it's divided, but not all the way down to the vein. So that's the difference between lobed and compound, is it's divided into bits that are different from each other. But there's still a connection of leaf blade connecting those bits. One term, I don't know how often this comes up, abaxial and adaxial. Delightfully difficult to tell the difference. Yeah. Aha. The mulberry leaf. So I often describe mulberries as being irregularly lobed. So this is one that even in the plant, sometimes it makes lobed leaves and sometimes not lobed leaves. You can find a mulberry that's got always leaves without any lobes and sometimes very lobed. So this would be, yeah, it's basically lobed. This is a lobe, but the other side of the leaf, not so much. Just in general with the vocabulary, there's a limit to how much you could just throw one word at something and let people think, like, come up with the right mental image for it. So yeah, I would probably use lobes to describe that. Say it's irregularly lobed is what I like to say. Like, it's not diagnostic if you found lobes or not lobes. They could either one be present on this mulberry tree. But this one, half lobed, I don't know. It's kind of an unusual format right there to be kind of half lobed. What if we go back to, well, let's finish up this one. So these terms, abaxial and adaxial, unfortunately, you can't always just say top and bottom for a leaf. So leaves, sometimes they're not oriented exactly up and down. So instead we have this definition, abaxial and adaxial, that refers to how they're produced kind of facing the stem. So really push my drawing powers here. Mid vein there. And draw one that kind of peels around the stem a little bit. So what's most often the upper surface is the adaxial surface. So generally, 9 times out of 10, you can just think of adaxial as the top. Ad means toward. And the axial part of that, the axis, is basically the stem. So the top of the leaf is mostly the one that's produced as it's produced toward the stem, and then it leans back and folds out and becomes the top. And the underside in this case would be the one that's away from the axis, abaxial. This one, unfortunately, even even if you're trying to be nice to your audience and use words that are familiar, top and bottom just aren't precise enough, really. So even in this, the oak on the left there, you can see that the person who took this got some shiny abaxial surfaces, and then this one leaf that's showing its abaxial surface, and just wouldn't really be able to choose up and down from that. One leaf's got its adaxial up, one's got its abaxial up. One feature you can sometimes use to know top from bottom is the abaxial usual bottom tends to have more projecting veins. So the veins have the job of moving water and sugars through the leaf, but they also have a very important structural role. So they're sort of like a girder, like a steel beam holding up this leaf, and they tend to project on the bottom side, the abaxial surface more. So up here we've got adaxial top surface in the top image here, abaxial underside. In this image here, you can see the vein projecting more. And this also, I have both of these images on here to illustrate the differences. So someone's describing these in a key. If you're trying to identify a plant and it says it's hairy on one side of the leaf and not hairy on the other side of the leaf, that can be very important. Shiny on one side, different colors, or whatever you've got. Let's go back to this one. So back to that plant, Lysimachia quadrifolia. Description of the leaf. So whorled, we covered that. Petiole absent or 1 to 3 millimeters, 0.1 to 0.3 centimeters. So maybe start conjuring up an image of this leaf. Aciliate, the E in there says it doesn't have these ciliate hairs. That might be hard to get without a dictionary. Blade, elliptic to lanceolate or ovate. Jump ahead to shapes. So elliptic to lanceolate to ovate. Lots and lots of terms people use for leaf shape. These are a little bit geometrical terms you might be familiar with from before. I put a little attachment point on these just to make sure it's clear. So linear, more like a line, rather thin, with even parallel edges throughout. I'd say probably one of the biggest differences between how we use common terms and how they're used here is this shape. I'd say a lot of people would call this shape here an oval, right? Oh, it doesn't count. So oval, the origin of oval is in egg. So an oval shape, ovate, it's more egg-shaped than symmetrical compressed circle. So the ovate shape is, it's by definition, is going to be the widest point of the leaf is below the middle of the leaf. So we've got the middle about here, and go down a little bit, it's the widest part, makes that an ovate leaf. Whereas an elliptic leaf, or elliptical, would have its widest point about at the middle. So more symmetrical in 2 dimensions leaf shape. All right, so elliptic, ovate, and ovate to lanceolate is basically, lanceolate is a skinny ovate. And a lot of times you'll see, as in that description, kind of a range of values. So, just in case somebody's got a different idea, or maybe there's some variation within the species. Where do we go here? Elliptic to lanceolate or ovate. So they're covering lots of bases there with the variation that might exist in that species. So elliptic to ovate to lanceolate. Pretty rare, I'd say, like a perfectly orbicular leaf, perfectly circular. Spatulate is with a broad blade that kind of tapers toward the base, like a spatula. And then these two, oblanceolate and obovate. The ob, I usually just think of that as being upside down. So it's the normal ovate shape, except it's now fatter, wider on the other side of the middle. Makes it obovate. And oblanceolate, just a skinnier version of that. And then just one for a little tidbit there, term that sometimes comes up. Chordate means heart shape. Leaf venation, three big kinds of leaf venation: pinnate, palmate, and parallel. Pinnate is like a feather, so it's got these secondary veins coming out along the midvein. Palmate has its main veins all tracing back to the base of the blade. Here we've got like 5 main veins that are all tracing back to that same origin spot. Palmate. And then parallel, pretty much matching the geometry definition of parallel, with the exception that, of course, parallel lines in geometry don't cross. Parallel lines, parallel veins in a leaf, they might be coming back together at the tip or the base, but mostly not touching each other, not branching out from each other. These are the main veins. We've got venation, and venation language also helps us out with talking about our different kinds of compound leaves. So leaves can be compound that are pinnately compound or palmately compound. So very much like the pinnate and palmate venation. Sometimes a little extreme. The one on the right is bipinnate, so it's pinnate and then it's pinnate again. This whole thing is one compound leaf. So even these pinnate divisions are themselves divided into pinnate divisions. Then basically, pinnately and palmately compound are big categories. And if you happen to have 3 leaflets on your leaf, 3 doesn't really tell you if you're pinnate or palmate. So it gets its own term, trifoliolate. Try saying that more times than once. Angles, this one does stick pretty well with geometry, so sometimes leaf bases or tips are described as acute or obtuse. So what I put on here are 90-degree angles. Acute angles are less than 90 degrees. Obtuse angles are greater than 90 degrees. And then some differences highlighted with the base. So these 2 leaves have similar shape, but one is attached at the narrow end and one is attached at the fat end. The margin is the edge of the leaf blade. And entire leaves have basically smooth margins. Sometimes they're just described as having teeth, and sometimes the keys don't really go any farther than that. Sometimes they use these terms serrate and dentate. And the difference between serrate and dentate is serrate teeth are angled, and dentate teeth are basically perpendicular to the main angle of the margin. So dentate sticks straight out, serrate are angled. So a couple of these are both serrate. Lots of terms for hairs in plants. So plants have a variety of coverings. And in my experience, the terminology for hairs is different authors have different terms they prefer to use, and sometimes there's maybe overlap of one of these terms to another. So I put them on there, but I don't know if I'd memorize these exactly. The one that might come up the most is pubescent. And that's kind of memorable, right? Pubescent, when people are pubescent, that's where hair shows up in weird places. Pubescent, hairy. And then if you reach like next level hairy, you get to hirsute and tomentose. That term glabrous on there, glabrous or glabrous, refers to not having any hairs, so that's often used. And the second bullet point is a reminder that these features, if you're looking for hairs, they're often ones that you need to have some kind of magnification to see. So plant hairs are not always visible to the naked eye, depending on how good your eyes are. And guidebooks basically assume that you've got magnification available. So when we go out in the field, we'll bring our magnification with us. From a long time ago, you can buy T-shirts that are from a website called Hirsute History. So hirsute is one of these words for being hairy. They take famous people and they boil them down to their distinctive hairstyles, be it head hair, beard hair, whatever you got. All right, let's go back to our description here and see if we learn anything more about our leaves. All right, here's one, margins entire. So the edge of that plant without margins on it. Here we've got glabrous, or sometimes sparsely pubescent. Apex acuminate or acute. So we did see acute for an angle. Acuminate is sort of a tapering point. Perfect. All right. I thought maybe conjuring up a mental image wasn't going to do it 100%. All right, so this is just a photograph. Of course, in the field, you'd have the nice opportunity of getting closer to examine this. But we have leaf shape at least described on there. So whorled, 1, 2, 3, 4. I mentioned this is rare, but this happened to, I don't know, it was the one that came to mind. It's kind of an interesting plant. It's called the whorled loosestrife. So it's got 1, 2, 3, 4 leaves all coming from that same location on the stem. A little hard to see, but there's another four leaf set below it. Petiole absent or short. I think that makes sense, right? So that's technically a little bit of petiole, but you might even be tempted to call that absent. Blades, elliptic to lanceolate or ovate. So these ones appear to be pretty wide. I would call those probably ovate. Here's a nice illustration of ovate where its widest place is about here, closer to the base. Glabrous are sometimes sparsely pubescent, a little hard to see on a photograph, but it has a little bit kind of a roughened look to it, maybe has some hairs on there. Venation pinnate, so secondary veins coming out along the mid vein. Densely to sparsely punctate. Sparsely pubescent. Oh, margins slightly. Okay, so the main leaf pubescent at least along the abaxial veins and margins. There's abaxial for you. So we don't have any images of abaxial looking down the top of this plant. All right, so obviously if you have a plant, you'd know what the plant looks like, but then being able to match it with the vocabulary would allow you to match whether you've successfully identified the correct plant or not. So I think we're most of the way through this topic. We're basically out of time. I think I'll call it with this, and we'll pick up next time, just wrap this up and start in with the reproductive stuff. There is a quiz available. It's a review of the